Hi, this is Green Philosophy. Today I'm going to be presenting a dramatic reading of Trump's Useful Idiots. A bankrupt liberal class, by signing on for the Zionist witch hunt against supposed anti-Semites and refusing to condemn Israel for its genocide, provided the bullets to its executioners. The media, the universities, the Democratic Party, and liberals, by embracing the fiction of quote-unquote rampant anti-Semitism, end quote, laid the groundwork for their own demise. Columbia and Princeton, where Chris Hedges has taught, and Harvard, where Chris Hedges attended for divinity school, are not incubators of hatred towards Jews. The New York Times, where Christopher Hedges worked for 15 years, and which Trump calls a quote-unquote enemy of the people, is slavishly subservient to the Zionist narrative. What these institutions have in common is not anti-Semitism, but liberalism. And liberalism, with its creed of pluralism and inclusiveness, is slated by our authoritarian regime for obliteration. The conflation of outrage over the genocide with anti-Semitism is a sleazy tactic to silence protest and placate Zionist donors, the billionaire class and advertisers. These liberal institutions, weaponizing anti-Semitism, aggressively silenced and expelled critics, banned student groups such as Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. They allowed police to make hundreds of arrests of peaceful protesters on campuses, purged professors, and groveled before Congress. Used the words quote-unquote apartheid and quote-unquote genocide, and you are fired or excoriated. Zionist Jews in this fictional narrative are the oppressed. Jews who protest the genocide are slandered as Hamas stooges and punished. Good Jews, bad Jews. One group deserves protection. The other deserves to be thrown to the wolves. This odious bifurcation exposes the charade. In April 2024, Columbia University President Minouche Shafik, along with 2 board members and a law professor, testified before the House of Representatives Education Committee. They accepted the premise that anti-Semitism was a significant problem at Columbia and at other higher education institutions. When co-chair of the Board of Trustees of Columbia University, David Greenwald and others told the committee that they believed, quote unquote, from the river to the sea, end quote, and quote, long live the Intifada, end quote, were anti-Semitic statements. Shafik agreed. She threw students and faculty under the bus, including longtime professor Joseph Massad. The day after the hearings, Shahid suspended all the students at the Columbia protests and called in the New York City Police Department, NYPD, who arrested at least 108 students. Shafik wrote, I have determined that the encampment and related disruptions pose a clear and present danger to the substantial functioning of the university. She wrote in her letter to the police. New York Police Department Chief John Chell, however, told the press, quote unquote, the students who were arrested were peaceful, offering no resistance whatsoever, and were saying what they wanted to say in a peaceful manner, end quote. Representative Elise Stefanik asked, quote, what disciplinary action has been taken against that professor, end quote, when asked in a hearing about Columbia law professor Catherine Frank. Shafik volunteered that Frank, whose position at the law school, where she had taught for 25 years, was terminated, and other professors were being investigated. In an apparent reference to visiting Columbia professor Mohammed Abdu, she claimed he was, quote-unquote, terminated, end quote, and promised he will, quote, will never teach at Columbia again, end quote. Professor Abdu is suing Columbia for defamation, discrimination, harassment, and financial and professional loss. The Center for Constitutional Rights wrote of the betrayal of Frank in an egregious attack on both academic freedom and Palestinian rights advocacy. Columbia University has entered into a quote-unquote agreement, end quote, with Catherine Frank to leave her teaching position after an esteemed 25-year career. The move, a quote-unquote termination dressed up in more palatable terms, end quote, according to Frank's statement, stems from her advocacy for students who speak out in support of Palestinian rights. Her ostensible offense was a comment expressing concern about Columbia's failure to address harassment of Palestinians and their allies by Israeli students who come to campus straight from military service, after Israeli students sprayed Palestinian rights protesters with a toxic chemical. For this, she was investigated for harassment and found to be in violation of Columbia's policies. The actual cause of her forced departure is the crackdown on dissent at Columbia, resulting from historic protests opposing Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Frank's fate was sealed when former Columbia president Manouche Shafik threw her under the bus during her cowardly appearance before Congress. You can see Chris Hedges' interview with Frank on his Substack. Despite her capitulation to the Zionist lobby, Shafik resigned a little more than a year after assuming her position as head of the university. The crackdown at Columbia continues with an estimated 80 people arrested and over 65 students suspended following a protest in the library in the first week of May. Former television journalist Claire Shipman condemned the protest, stating, quote unquote, disruptions to our academic activities will not be tolerated and are violations of our rules and policies. Columbia strongly condemns violence on our campus, anti-Semitism, and all forms of hate and discrimination, some of which we witnessed today, end quote. Of course, appeasement does not work. This witch hunt, whether under Biden or the Trump administration, was never grounded in good faith. It was about decapitating Israel's critics and marginalizing the liberal class and the left. It is sustained by lies and by slander, which these institutions continue to embrace. Watching these liberal institutions, who are hostile to the left, be smeared by Trump for harboring quote-unquote Marxist lunatics, radical leftists, and communists, end quote, exposes another failing of the liberal class. It was the left that could have saved these institutions, or at least given them the fortitude, not to mention analysis, to take a principled stand. The left at least calls apartheid, apartheid, and genocide, genocide. Media outlets regularly publish articles and op-eds, opinion editorials, uncritically accepting claims made by Zionist students and faculty. They clarify the distinction, they fail to clarify the distinction between being Jewish and being Zionist. They demonize student protesters. They never bothered reporting with any depth or honesty from the student encampments where Jews, Muslims, and Christians made common cause. They routinely mischaracterize anti-Zionist, anti-genocide, and pro-Palestinian liberation slogans and policy demands as hate speech, anti-Semitic, or contributing to Jewish students feeling unsafe. Examples include the New York Times, why the campus protests are so troubling. I'm a Columbia professor. The protests on my campus are not justice, and universities face an urgent question. What makes protests anti-Semitic? Then the Washington Post called the campus protests what they are. At Columbia, excuse the students, but not the faculty. The Atlantic, campus protest encampments are unethical. And Columbia University's anti-Semitism problem. Slates, when pro-Palestine protests cross into anti-Semitism. Fox, the rising tide of anti-Semitism on college campuses amid Gaza protests. Mother Jones, how pro-Palestine protests spark anti-Semitism on campus. The Cut from New York Magazine, the problem with pro-Palestine protests on campus. And the Daily Beast, anti-Semitism surges amid pro-Palestine protests at U.S. universities. The New York Times, in a decision worthy of George Orwell, instructed its reporters to issue words such as quote-unquote refugee camps, occupied territory, slaughter, massacre, carnage, genocide, and ethnic cleansing when writing about Palestine. And again, I encourage the watchers of Green Philosophy to boycott the New York Times and boycott all corporate media. They were told to do this when writing about Palestine, according to an internal memo obtained by The Intercept. It discourages the very use of the word Palestine in routine text and headlines. In December 2023, Democratic Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, sent a letter to university and college presidents who failed to condemn and address quote-unquote anti-Semitism, end quote, and calls for the genocide of any group. Hochul warned they would be subjected to an aggressive enforcement action by New York State. The following year, in late August, Hochul reported these warnings during a virtual meeting with 200 university and college leaders. Hochul made clear in October 2024 that she considered pro-Palestine slogans to be explicit calls for the genocide of Jews. Hochul said, there are laws on the books, human rights laws, state and federal laws, that I will enforce if you allow for the discrimination of our students on our campuses. Even calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, which is what is meant from the river to the sea. By the way, she said at a memorial event at the Temple Israel Center in White Plains, those are not innocent sounding words. They're filled with hate, end quote. Governor Hochul successfully pressured City University of New York, CUNY, to remove a job posting for a Palestinian Studies professorship at Hunter College, which referenced quote-unquote settler colonialism, genocide, and apartheid, end quote. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, in his new book, Anti-Semitism in America, A Warning, leads efforts by the Democratic Party, which had a dismal 27% approval rating in a recent NBC News poll, to denounce those protesting the genocide as carrying out a quote-unquote blood libel against Jews. And again, I encourage my listeners for Green Philosophy to boycott Chuck Schumer's book, Anti-Semitism in America. Schumer said, whatever one's view of how the war in Gaza was conducted, it is not and has never been the policy of the Israeli government to exterminate the Palestinian people, ignoring hundreds of calls by Israeli officials to wipe Palestinians from the face of the earth during 19 months of saturation bombing and enforced starvation. The grisly truth, openly acknowledged by Israeli officials, is far different. We are disassembling Gaza and leaving it as piles of rubble, with total destruction, which has no precedent globally. And the world isn't stopping us, gloats Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich. Last night, almost 100 Gazans were killed. It doesn't interest anyone. Everyone has gotten used to the fact that we can kill 100 Gazans in one night during a war, and nobody cares in the world. Israel Knesset member Zvi Succo told Israel's Channel 12 on May 16th. The perpetuation of the fiction of widespread anti-Semitism, which of course exists, but which is not fostered nor is condoned by these institutions, coupled with the refusal to say out loud what is being live streamed to the world, has shattered what little moral authority these institutions and liberals had left. It gives credibility to Trump's effort to cripple and destroy all institutions that sustain a liberal democracy. Trump surrounds himself with neo-Nazi sympathizers such as Elon Musk and Christian fascists who condemn Jews for crucifying Christ. But anti-Semitism by the right gets a free pass since these good, end quote, anti-Semites cheer on Israel's settler colonial project of extermination. One these neo-Nazis and Christian fascists would like to replicate on brown and black in the name of the Great Replacement Theory. Trump trumpets the fiction of quote-unquote white genocide, end quote, in South Africa. He signed an executive order in February that fast-tracked immigration to the United States for Afrikaners, white South Africans. And again, I would encourage the listeners of Deep Green Philosophy to check out Paul Street's book, Amerikaners, which is a play on Afrikaners. Trump, neoliberalism, check that book is amazing. Okay, Harvard, which is attempting to save itself from the wrecking ball of the Trump administration, was as complicit in the witch hunt as everyone else, flagellating itself for not being more repressive toward campus critics of the genocide. The university's former president, Claudine Gay, condemned the pro-Palestine slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which demands the right of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, as bearing quote-unquote specific historical meanings that to a great many people imply the eradication of Jews from Israel, end quote. Harvard substantially tightened its regulations regarding student protests in January 2024 and increased the police presence on its campus. It barred 13 students from graduating, citing alleged policy violations linked to their participation in a protest encampment, despite an earlier agreement to avoid punitive measures. It placed more than 20 students on quote-unquote involuntary leave, end quote, and in some cases evicted students from their housing. Such policies were replicated across the country. The capitulations and crackdowns on pro-Palestinian activism, academic freedom, freedom of speech, suspensions, expulsions, and firings since October 7th, 2023 have not spared U.S. colleges and universities from further attacks. Since Trump took office, at least $11 billion in federal research grants and contracts have been cut or frozen nationwide, according to NPR. And I wrote specifically to the University of Alabama president when Trump came to speak there, and I noticed the inconsistency of massive research grants were cut at University of Alabama, and yet they were still willing to have Trump speak there. Harvard had $3 billion in grants cut. Columbia had $400 million in grants cut. University of Pennsylvania had $175 million in grants cut, and Brandeis had $6 to $7.5 million yearly cut. On May 22nd, the Trump administration intensified its attacks on Harvard by terminating its ability to enroll international students that make up 27% of the student body. This administration is holding Harvard accountable for fostering violence, anti-Semitism, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party on its campus. Kristi Noem, Department of Homeland Security, DHS secretary, wrote on X, Twitter. When posting screenshots of the letter she sent to Harvard revoking foreign student enrollment. Let this serve as a warning to all universities and academic institutions across the country, end quote. Harvard, like Columbia, the media, the Democratic Party, and the liberal class misread power by refusing to acknowledge or name the genocide in Gaza and persecuting those who do. They provided the bullets to their executioners. These institutions and the liberal class are paying the price for their stupidity as well as for their cowardice. And this has been Trump's Useful Idiots, a dramatic reading from Chris Hedges' Substack. I look forward to your questions and comments.